Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and while he had been moved to tears on numerous occasions, he had always managed to maintain his composure and continue with the show. But on that bright spring afternoon in 2025, a 94-year-old World War II veteran named Frank Rossi would tell a story so profoundly heroic, so humble in its telling yet so extraordinarily brave in its content, that Steve would completely break down on stage, sobbing so hard that production would have to stop for 20 minutes while he composed himself. This wasn't a story of shame or hidden guilt like so many shocking revelations that had come before. This was something different, a story of genuine heroism that had gone unrecognized for 8 decades, a story of sacrifice and courage that the veteran himself had never shared with his own family, not because it brought him shame, but because he had never believed it was worth mentioning. 2 families stood ready to compete, the Thompson family from Ohio and the Rossi family from New Jersey. The Rossi family immediately captured everyone's attention because at their center stood Frank Rossi, a diminutive 94-year-old man who stood barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, with thick white hair, bright brown eyes that sparkled with life despite his age, and an energy that seemed remarkable for someone born in 1931. He wore a simple blue cardigan over a white shirt, and around his neck hung dog tags on a silver chain that he touched occasionally, almost unconsciously. His family surrounded him with obvious adoration, 4 generations including his daughter Maria, who was in her late 60s, his grandchildren in their 40s, his great-grandchildren who ranged from teenagers to young adults, and even 2 great-great-grandchildren, small children who kept reaching for their Nano Frank's hands. During the pre-interview, Frank had been cheerful and talkative, cracking jokes with the producers and making everyone laugh with stories about growing up in Brooklyn in the 1930s and 40s. When asked about his military service, he had mentioned casually that he had served in World War II and Korea, but he had quickly changed the subject to talk about his late wife Rosa, who had passed away 5 years earlier, and about his large Italian-American family that still gathered every Sunday for dinner at his house. The producers had tried to ask more about his war service, sensing there might be a story there, but Frank had waved it off saying, "I did my job like everyone else did. Nothing special to tell." His family had nodded in agreement, clearly used to their father and grandfather's modesty about his military service, never pressing him for details about a part of his life he seemed to prefer not to discuss. The Rossi family won their game with enthusiastic teamwork, Frank contributing several perfect answers and showing remarkable quick thinking for someone his age. As they lined up for fast money, there was no question that Frank would be one of the 2 players, and his great-grandson Marcus went first, scoring 179 points, which meant Frank needed 21 points to secure the $20,000. Frank approached the podium with surprising energy, no walker or cane needed despite his 94 years, and Steve greeted him with his trademark warmth, joking, "Mr. Rossi, you're sharper than most of these young folks we get up here. What's your secret?" Frank laughed and said, "Good Italian food and not taking life too seriously, Steve." They were about to begin fast money when Steve noticed Frank's dog tags, and in a spontaneous moment that would change everything, reached out and gently touched them, saying, "I see you've got your dog tags on, sir. You said you served in World War II. Frank's expression shifted slightly, the playful energy dimming as something deeper moved across his face. He touched the tags and said quietly, "Yes, I served. 101st Airborne. Normandy, Market Garden, Bastogne." Steve's eyes widened, recognizing those legendary battles, and he said, "Sir, those are some of the most significant battles in World War II. That's incredible service." But Frank just shrugged and said, "A lot of men served. A lot of men did a lot more than I did." Steve was about to move on to the game, but something made him pause. He looked at Frank more closely and said, "Mr. Rossi, I get the feeling there's a story here that maybe you haven't told. Am I right?" The studio went quiet, and Frank's family looked surprised, his daughter Maria saying, "Dad's always been very modest about his service. He never really talks about the war." Frank looked at Steve, then at his family, and then something seemed to shift in him. He said, "There is something I've never told them. Something I've never told anyone, really, except the men who were there with me, and most of them are gone now." Steve's professional instincts were telling him to proceed to the game, but something deeper, some human recognition that this moment was important, made him say, "Sir, if you want to share it, we'd be honored to hear it, but only if you're comfortable." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his hand still touching his dog tags, and then he nodded slowly and said, "I think it's time. I'm 94 years old, and if I don't tell this story now, it dies with me, and maybe it shouldn't. Maybe my family should know what their old Nano did when he was just a kid." Steve nodded, and the studio fell into that particular profound silence that happens when people sense something significant is about to be shared. Frank took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady, but weighted with memory. What he told over the next 30 minutes would be one of the most extraordinary stories of heroism and sacrifice ever shared on television, would leave Steve Harvey unable to continue, would move the entire studio to tears, and would ultimately lead to Frank receiving recognition that was 8 decades overdue. Frank began, "It was December 1944, and I was 18 years old. I'd lied about my age to enlist in 1943 when I was just 16 because all my friends were going and I wanted to serve my country. By December '44 I was with the 101st Airborne at Bastogne in Belgium, during what they later called the Battle of the Bulge. If you don't know that battle, it was one of the worst of the war. The Germans had launched a surprise offensive. We were surrounded, we were outnumbered, it was freezing cold, we were low on ammunition and supplies, and men were dying from cold and enemy fire every day. Our position was desperate, and everyone knew it, but we held because that's what you did, you held." Steve was listening intently, and Frank's family was equally transfixed, clearly hearing details they had never heard before. Frank continued, "On December 22, 1944, I was part of a small patrol sent out to try to find a supply drop that had been made but had landed outside our perimeter, in an area between our lines and German positions. There were 8 of us, led by a lieutenant named James Morrison from Texas. We found the supply drop, but as we were trying to recover it, we came under fire from a German position we hadn't known was there. It was a small squad, maybe 6 or 7 German soldiers, positioned in a destroyed building about 200 yards away." Frank paused, his hand gripping the podium, and Steve noticed tears beginning to form in the old veteran's eyes. Frank said, "In the firefight, Lieutenant Morrison was hit, shot in the leg and the stomach. The rest of us took cover and tried to return fire, but we were in a terrible position, completely exposed, and the Germans had us pinned down. 2 more of our guys were hit, 1 killed instantly, the other wounded badly in the shoulder. That left 5 of us still able to fight, and we were stuck in the open with our lieutenant bleeding out and Germans shooting at us from a fortified position. We knew if we stayed where we were, we'd all be killed, but we couldn't retreat and carry our wounded, and none of us were willing to leave Lieutenant Morrison and the other wounded man behind." Frank's voice cracked as he continued, "So I did something that I still don't know if it was brave or just stupid. I was the smallest guy in the unit, just a skinny Italian kid from Brooklyn who weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, and I realized I could move faster than the bigger guys. I told them I was going to create a distraction, draw the German fire, and while I did that, they should grab the lieutenant and the wounded man and get back to our lines." Steve's face showed dawning comprehension of what Frank was describing, and he said quietly, "Mr. Rossi, are you saying you deliberately drew enemy fire to yourself?" Frank nodded and said, "I left cover and I ran, not toward our lines, but perpendicular to them, across the open ground, making myself the biggest target I could be, yelling and shooting toward the German position. The Germans immediately focused all their fire on me because I was moving and I was obvious, and that gave my squad the chance they needed to grab Lieutenant Morrison and our other wounded guy and start moving back toward our lines. I kept running and dodging, and I don't know how, but somehow they kept missing me. I could hear bullets hitting the snow around me, could feel them passing close enough to hear, but none of them hit me. I ran for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2, and then I dove into a shell crater and stayed there, while the Germans kept shooting at the spot where I disappeared." The studio was absolutely silent, everyone transfixed by Frank's matter-of-fact description of extraordinary bravery. Frank continued. I stayed in that crater for about 10 minutes, until the German fire stopped, and I thought maybe they'd given up, or maybe they thought they'd hit me. I was planning to wait until dark, and then try to make it back to our lines, but then I heard something that changed everything. I heard American voices crying out, and when I carefully looked over the edge of the crater, I saw that during the firefight, 2 more of our guys had been hit and had fallen not far from where I was, maybe 50 yards away, between my position and the German position. They were both wounded, both calling for help, and I knew if I left them there, they would either bleed to death or the Germans would come out and capture them, and I couldn't let that happen. Steve's face showed something like awe mixed with horror at what he was hearing, and Frank's daughter Maria had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she heard this story for the first time. Frank said, "So I made another decision that was probably stupid but felt necessary. I waited until I thought the Germans might be focused on something else, and then I ran from my crater to where the first wounded man was. His name was Tommy Brennan from Chicago, and he'd been shot in both legs and couldn't move. I grabbed him and I dragged him back to my crater, and somehow again the Germans either didn't see me or their shots missed. Tommy was crying, kept saying he thought he was going to die, and I told him he wasn't dying on my watch and to shut up and let me think." Despite the intensity of the story, a few people in the studio laughed at this, and Frank smiled slightly before continuing. "I got Tommy settled in the crater as best I could, did what I could to bandage his legs with his own torn uniform, and then I did the same thing again. I ran out to where the second wounded man was, a private named Eddie Kowalski from Detroit who had been shot in the chest and was in really bad shape. I dragged Eddie back to the crater too, and by this time the Germans definitely knew where I was because they were shooting directly at my position, but the crater was deep enough that we were protected as long as we stayed down." Frank's voice grew quieter, heavier with memory, as he said, "I had 2 badly wounded men in a shell crater. The Germans knew where we were. It was getting dark, it was freezing cold, and I knew that if we stayed there overnight without help, Tommy and Eddie would die from their wounds and the cold, and I might die too. But I also knew that if I tried to move them back to our lines, which were maybe 400 yards away across open ground, the Germans would shoot us before we got 50 feet. So I made a decision that saved their lives but could have gotten all of us killed. I decided to go to the German position and try to convince them to stop shooting long enough for me to get my wounded men to safety." The gasps from the audience were audible, and Steve said, "Wet, you went to the German position. You approached enemy soldiers while under fire." Frank nodded and said, "I left Tommy and Eddie in the crater, told them I'd be back, and I stood up with my hands raised and walked toward the German position yelling in English, and in the little bit of German I knew that I had wounded men and I wanted to get them to safety and I wasn't a threat." The studio was completely silent, everyone holding their breath, and Frank continued, "The Germans stopped shooting and I walked closer, hands up, until I was maybe 20 yards from their position. A German soldier came out, an older guy, probably in his 40s, and he had his rifle pointed at me, but he wasn't shooting. I said in broken German that I had wounded men, that I wanted to take them back to American lines, and that I wasn't asking them to help me, just asking them not to shoot while I did it. The German soldier looked at me for a long time, and then he said something in German to his men behind him, and then he said to me in pretty good English, 'You are very brave or very foolish, American boy. We will not shoot while you take your wounded, but you take them and you go, and you do not come back.' I thanked him, I actually said danky, and then I turned around and walked back to the crater, expecting every second to feel a bullet in my back, but they didn't shoot." Steve Harvey's face was streaming with tears now, but Frank continued, "I got back to Tommy and Eddie, and I knew I couldn't carry both of them at the same time, so I'd have to make 2 trips. I picked up Tommy first, threw him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry even though he weighed more than I did, and I started walking toward our lines. The Germans didn't shoot. I walked as fast as I could, Tommy crying and groaning the whole way, and after what felt like forever but was probably 15 minutes, I got close enough to our lines that our guys saw me and came out to help. I handed Tommy to them, and then before anyone could stop me, I turned around and went back for Eddie. They tried to stop me, said I'd done enough, but I told them I'd promised Eddie I'd come back and I was going back. So I walked back across that open ground, back toward the German position, and they still didn't shoot. I got to the crater where Eddie was, and he was in bad shape, barely conscious, and I picked him up the same way and carried him back to our lines. The Germans never fired a single shot while I was carrying those wounded men, and I've thought about that German soldier every day since, wondered who he was, wondered if he survived the war, wanted to thank him for honoring his word and not shooting me when he easily could have. Frank paused, wiping tears from his eyes, and Steve Harvey was openly sobbing now, not even trying to hide it, his shoulders shaking as he cried. Frank continued, Tommy Brennan survived. His legs were messed up and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he survived, married his sweetheart, had 4 kids, and lived until 2003. He wrote me letters for years afterward, thanking me for saving his life. Eddie Kowalski died 3 days after I brought him in. His chest wound was too severe, and despite the medic's best efforts, he didn't make it. But he died warm and among friends instead of bleeding out alone in a frozen crater, and I've always hoped that mattered. Frank looked at his family, tears now flowing freely down his weathered face, and said, I've never told you this story because I didn't think it was special. I just did what anyone would have done. I couldn't leave those men out there to die, and I was the smallest and fastest, so it made sense for me to be the one to go. But it wasn't heroism to me. It was just doing my job and taking care of my brothers. Steve Harvey tried to speak several times but couldn't form words, just standing there crying and shaking his head in disbelief. Frank's daughter Maria came forward and embraced her father, sobbing, and she said, Dad, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you keep this hidden for 80 years? Frank held his daughter and said, Because it hurt too much to talk about, sweetheart. Every time I thought about that day, I thought about Eddie dying, about all the men who didn't make it home, about how I survived when so many better men than me didn't. It felt wrong to talk about something that felt like heroism when I watched real heroes die all around me. Tommy kept trying to get me recognized, kept writing to the army saying I should get a medal, but I told him to stop, told him I didn't want attention for doing what was expected. After the war, I just wanted to come home, marry your mother, have a family, and live a quiet life. I didn't want to be known as some war hero. I just wanted to be Frank the barber, your father, Nano to the grandkids. Steve finally found his voice, though it was shaking badly, and he said, Mr. Rossi, what you did was beyond heroic. You risked your life multiple times to save wounded men. You walked toward an enemy position with your hands up, and you carried 2 wounded soldiers across 400 yards under potential enemy fire. That's not just doing your job, sir. That's extraordinary courage and selflessness. Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise, and said, I was 18 years old and scared out of my mind the whole time, Steve. I wasn't thinking about heroism or medals. I was thinking about getting Tommy and Eddie to safety and hoping that German soldier would keep his word and not shoot me in the back. He paused and added, and the thing is, what I did wasn't unique. Thousands of men did things just as brave or braver. Most of them were never recognized, and many of them didn't make it home to tell their stories. Every veteran I know has stories of courage and sacrifice that they've never shared because they don't think anyone would care, or because it hurts too much to remember, or because they feel like it was just what was expected. That's why I wanted to tell this today, not to make myself look good, but to represent all those men who did extraordinary things and never got credit, never wanted credit, just did their duty and came home and lived quiet lives. Steve had to sit down on the stage floor, overwhelmed by emotion, and production stopped completely while he tried to compose himself. After about 20 minutes, Steve stood back up, his eyes red and puffy, and he said to the camera, Ladies and gentlemen, I need to tell you something. In 20 years of hosting this show, I have never been so completely overwhelmed by a story. What Miss Stort? Frank Rossi just described is one of the most heroic things I've ever heard, and the fact that he never told anyone, that he's been walking around for 80 years like it was no big deal, that he thinks what he did was just normal. That breaks my heart and amazes me at the same time. He turned to Frank and said, "Sir, I don't know if you were ever officially recognized for what you did that day, but you should have been. You should have received the highest honors our military can give. And if it's not too late, I'm going to make sure that the right people hear this story, and that you get the recognition you deserve, even if it's 80 years late." Frank tried to protest, saying he didn't want any fuss, but his family was having none of it. His daughter, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, all of them were insisting that his story needed to be told, that his heroism needed to be recognized, and that they were proud beyond measure to be related to him. One of Frank's great-grandsons, a young man in his early 20s, said, No, I always thought you were the best grandfather in the world, but now I know you're also a genuine American hero, and I'm so proud to be your great-grandson I can barely stand it. Please let us help get you the recognition you deserve." Frank looked at his family, saw the love and pride on their faces, and finally nodded, saying, "If you think it matters, okay, but only if we also honor Tommy and Eddie, and all the other men who didn't make it home. This isn't about me, it's about all of them." Steve announced that the Rossi family would receive the $20,000 without playing fast money, and that he was personally adding another $50,000 to help the family however they wanted to use it, whether for Frank's care, for the family, or for veterans organizations in Frank's name. He also said that he was immediately reaching out to military authorities, to members of Congress, and to veterans organizations to make sure Frank's story was documented, and to see if he could still be recognized for his actions 80 years earlier. The studio audience gave a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, and Frank stood there looking embarrassed and moved, still touching his dog tags, still that modest kid from Brooklyn who didn't think what he'd done was anything special. The episode that eventually aired was expanded into a special 2-hour documentary that included Frank's full story, historical context about the Battle of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne, interviews with military historians who were astounded by Frank's account, and testimony from Tommy Brennan's children who confirmed that their father had spent his entire life telling everyone who would listen about the small Italian kid who saved his life. The special also included emotional interviews with Frank's family as they processed learning about their father and grandfather's extraordinary heroism, and footage of Frank visiting the American cemetery in Belgium where many of his fellow soldiers were buried, including Eddie Kowalski. The image of 94-year-old Frank standing at Eddie's grave, crying and saying, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you, buddy, but I tried, I really tried," became one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments in television history. The response to Frank's story was overwhelming and universal in its praise. Veterans organizations immediately began working to get Frank recognized, researching the incident and finding after-action reports and witness statements that corroborated his account. It turned out that Lieutenant Morrison, who Frank had helped save, had indeed filed a recommendation for Frank to receive the Medal of Honor, but it had been lost in the chaos of the war's final months and had never been processed. Tommy Brennan had also filed multiple recommendations over the years, all of which had been dismissed or ignored because too much time had passed or because documentation was insufficient. But with renewed attention and with Frank's own testimony, military authorities began the process of reviewing his case for belated recognition. In December 2025, on the 81st anniversary of the Battle of Bastogne, Frank Rossi was awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. At 94 years old, he became one of the oldest living recipients of the Medal of Honor, receiving it from the president for actions he had taken as an 18-year-old kid in December 1944. The citation described his repeated acts of bravery under fire, his selfless risk-taking to save wounded comrades, and his extraordinary courage in approaching an enemy position to negotiate safe passage for wounded men. Frank's entire family attended the ceremony, 4 generations watching as their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather finally received the recognition he had never sought but that everyone agreed he richly deserved. During his remarks at the ceremony, Frank said, I accept this honor not for myself, but for all the men who fought at Bastogne, for Tommy Brennan who I was able to save and who became my lifelong friend, for Eddie Kowalski who I couldn't save but who died with dignity, for Lieutenant Morrison who led us with courage, and for all the soldiers who did extraordinary things during that terrible war and never received recognition. I also accepted in honor of that German soldier who could have shot me but chose not to, who honored his word, and let me save my wounded comrades. War makes enemies of people who in other circumstances might have been friends, and I've always believed that soldier was a good man caught in a terrible situation, just like I was. If he survived the war and if by some miracle he or his descendants ever learn about this, I want them to know I've never forgotten his mercy and his honor. Frank's words about the German soldier who had spared him became almost as famous as his acts of heroism, prompting conversations about the humanity of soldiers on all sides of conflicts and the moments of grace that sometimes occurred even in the midst of war. Steve Harvey attended the Medal of Honor ceremony, and he spoke about how Frank's story had affected him personally, had changed how he thought about heroism and humility, and had reminded him that extraordinary people often live quiet lives never seeking recognition for extraordinary things they've done. He said that the moment when Frank had told his story on Family Feud, when Steve had been so overwhelmed he couldn't speak and had to sit down on the stage floor and cry, had been the most genuine and powerful emotional experience of his entire career. He said that meeting Frank Rossi and hearing his story had been a privilege that he would carry for the rest of his life. Frank lived for another year after receiving the Medal of Honor, dying peacefully in his sleep in December 2026, just days after the 82nd anniversary of the Battle of Bastogne and just 3 months after his 95th birthday. His funeral was attended by military officials, veterans from multiple wars, his enormous extended family, and thousands of people who had been touched by his story. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, his Medal of Honor placed on his casket, and his dog tags, which he had worn every day for 80 years, buried with him. The funeral included remembrances of Frank as a husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, barber, friend, and hero, with speakers emphasizing that he had been all of those things equally, and that his heroism in war had been matched by his kindness and humility in the long peace that followed. Frank's daughter Maria gave a eulogy that captured who her father had been, saying, "My father was the most humble man I've ever known. He cut hair for 50 years, he made Sunday dinners for his family every week, he told terrible jokes that made us all groan, he taught his grandchildren to play bots, and he lived a quiet, simple life filled with love and service to others. And all that time, we had no idea that this quiet barber was a genuine war hero who had risked his life over and over to save his fellow soldiers. When he finally told us his story on that Family Feud stage, it didn't change who he was to us, but it helped us understand the depth of his character, the courage he carried quietly, and the sacrifices his generation made. He never wanted recognition, never sought glory, just wanted to live a good life and be a good man." The Medal of Honor he received was meaningful to him not because it honored him, but because it honored all the veterans who served with him, and because it brought attention to the sacrifices of his generation. That was who my father was, a man who thought of others first, always, whether he was carrying wounded soldiers across a frozen battlefield or making sure his great-grandchildren had extra meatballs at Sunday dinner. The story of Frank Rossi became a powerful reminder of several important truths about heroism, humility, and the veterans who live among us. It showed that extraordinary courage is often carried quietly by ordinary people who never seek recognition. It demonstrated that thousands of veterans have stories of remarkable bravery that they've never shared, either because they don't think anyone would care, because they're too modest to tell them, or because the memories are too painful to revisit. It highlighted the importance of asking veterans about their service and creating spaces where they feel comfortable sharing their stories before those stories are lost forever. And it illustrated that heroism comes in many forms, that Frank's courage in approaching that German position was as remarkable as his courage in repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire, and that both were exceeded by his courage in living with the memory of those who didn't come home, and in honoring them by living a good and humble life. Frank's story also sparked important conversations about belated recognition for veterans whose heroism had gone unrecognized. In the wake of his Medal of Honor, military authorities received hundreds of nominations for other veterans whose acts of bravery had been overlooked, lost in paperwork, or simply never documented. A task force was created to review these cases and ensure that deserving veterans received recognition even if it came decades late. Frank's case became the template for how such reviews should be conducted, and over the following years, dozens of other elderly veterans received belated awards for actions taken in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts, ensuring that their courage was acknowledged before they passed away. The German soldier who had spared Frank was never identified with certainty, though historians and genealogists made efforts to track down German military records from that position at that time. Several possible candidates were identified, all of whom had died by the time Frank's story became public, but their families reached out to Frank's family to express their belief that their father or grandfather might have been the soldier who showed mercy that day. Frank's family welcomed these connections, creating a kind of honorary bond between families who had been enemies in 1944 but who were brought together in 2025 by a story of humanity in the midst of war. These connections led to a broader initiative bringing together families of American and German veterans from World War II, facilitating reconciliation, shared remembrance, and acknowledgement that soldiers on both sides had been human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control. Steve Harvey continued to speak about Frank Rossi frequently in the years after his death, using Frank's story as an example of true humility and heroism. He established a scholarship in Frank's name for descendants of World War II veterans, and he made it a point in his various shows and appearances to encourage people to ask their elderly relatives, particularly veterans, about their lives and experiences before those stories were lost. He often said that the 20 minutes he spent sitting on the Family Feud stage crying while trying to process Frank's story were 20 minutes that changed him, that gave him a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices of veterans, and that reminded him that television could sometimes accidentally become a vehicle for preserving important history and honoring those who deserve honor. In the end, Frank Rossi's story became a testament to the quiet heroism that exists all around us, carried by people who would never describe themselves as heroes, people who did extraordinary things, and then went home and lived ordinary lives, never seeking recognition, never believing they deserved special treatment, just doing their duty and moving forward. It showed that an 18-year-old kid from Brooklyn could act with extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances, could save lives at great risk to his own, could carry the memory of those actions with humility and grace for 80 years, and could finally share his story not to glorify himself, but to honor those who didn't come home. It demonstrated that heroism and humility are not opposites but often go hand in hand, that the people who do the most remarkable things are often the least likely to talk about them, and that sometimes the quiet barber making Sunday dinner for his family is also the young soldier who walked across a frozen battlefield carrying wounded men to safety while an enemy who could have killed him chose mercy instead. Frank's final interview, conducted just weeks before his death, showed him saying, "I didn't tell my story on Family Feud to get a medal or to be famous. I told it because I'm 94 years old and I realized that if I didn't tell it, nobody would know about Tommy and Eddie and Lieutenant Morrison and all those brave men who fought at Bastogne. I told it because that German soldier who let me save my wounded men deserves to be remembered for his humanity. I told it because my family deserved to know what their old Nano did when he was young. And I told it because I wanted people to understand that heroes are all around us, living quiet lives, never asking for recognition, just doing what's right because that's what you do. I'm not special. I was just a skinny kid who couldn't leave his brothers behind, and I've spent 80 years grateful to that German soldier for not shooting me when he could have, grateful to Tommy for surviving and being my friend, and sorry that I couldn't save Eddie. That's all I am and that's enough. G.